Good morning, everyone. I'm Ania Zbyszewska. I'm an assistant professor at the Warwick Law School in the United Kingdom, and I'm really pleased to be able to contribute to your discussions this morning or afternoon, I'm not sure, about the concept social reproduction and ways in which feminist labor lawyers and feminist lawyers generally have used it to think about labor law norms, legal norms, and assumptions that underlie them more generally, but also to evaluate various types of policies and reforms that seek to better enable people to better balance work and family obligations. So, policies of work family reconciliation, for example, are one such a recent policy trend that is widespread, and yet which, as you know from, for instance, the reading by Judy Fudge, can be sometimes problematic and can continue to exhibit some biased and gendered assumptions about how best to share and who should share the responsibilities for unpaid care work, for instance. So I know you've been talking about social reproduction as a concept already, so I will not spend a lot of time talking about the concept social reproduction, apart from just highlighting perhaps the key sort of assumptions that feminists make about social reproduction and why it's important. So first, feminist political economists have built on previous thinking about social reproduction, which comes mostly from Marxist theory, to say that one, it is an essential social process, but secondly, they also reiterate that this is not just an essential social process, but it is also one that is essential to a viable and well-functioning economy. Feminist political economists have said that and shown that social reproduction and productive processes are actually intertwined very tightly, and that the productive activity often depends on social reproductive work, but that social reproductive work is kind of subordinated to it, particularly in conditions of capitalism. And so, based on these two sort of points, that it's an essential social process and one that is viable to or necessary to a viable economy, they have also said that what is necessary then for social reproduction to be truly supported is that the valuable work that is involved in social reproduction needs to be valued and recognized. So recognition of the contribution of social reproduction is one thing that feminist scholars have been seeking. And so in the 70s, for instance, there were famous wages for housework campaigns that feminists staged, but also more contemporary discussions about valuation of care or right to care, or efforts by feminist economists, for instance, to actually calculate unpaid work and the contribution that it makes, or domestic work and care work both, and add it into national GDPs is another example of how feminists have been seeking recognition of the value of social reproduction. So recognition is one point, and redistribution is another point. And here feminist scholars have been talking about the need to better redistribute work of social reproduction between various social institutions, between public and private sphere, and between women and men. And so if we take these two kind of demands around recognition of social reproduction and its redistribution, better redistribution, we can then use these demands to, in a sense, think about how the extent to which they are reflected in contemporary efforts to enable people to better balance work and family. So all these new reforms that seek both to increase women's labor market participation, but also better balance work and family, could be evaluated from the perspective of whether they contribute to better recognition and redistribution of social reproduction. And so it's from this perspective then that I have approached in my research evaluation, kind of studying of developments in the Polish labor market regulation. I focused on regulation of working hours, but also but always from this perspective of the extent to which the working time regime that Poland has instantiated helps people balance work and family obligations, and the extent to which it assumes that care should be carried out within the public or the private sphere. So I want to talk about two sets of reforms that were adopted in Poland recently, so between 2009 and 2015. And before I do so, I just wanted to speak briefly about Poland to give you a little bit of context for understanding these current reforms. So many of you will know that between the end of the Second World War and the late 80s, early 90s, Poland was a state socialist planned economy. So it adopted a socialist model of development, and alongside other Central Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. One of the features of this model was that it was also a worker state. So there was kind of an obligation and a right of every adult citizen to participate in employment. And what this meant was that not only men but also women were expected to participate in labor markets, and that participation kind of was necessary for one's ability to draw on a range of rights and entitlements from the state. As a result of this, Poland and other Central Eastern European countries had some of the highest rates of women's labor market participation already in the 50s and 60s. So while in Western European countries, for instance, women were either housewives or participating in labor markets on a part-time basis, kind of being supplementary, kind of bringing supplementary incomes into homes. In Poland and other Central Eastern European countries, women were expected to participate on a full-time basis like their male partners. In order to make this possible, the Polish state socialist government needed to organize and support processes of social reproduction, so different kinds of tasks involved in this process. So as a result, in Poland, there was a fairly well-developed infrastructure for the provision of care, particularly for children and to a lesser extent for dependent adults, but this was a free, kind of state-organized care infrastructure. In addition to that, there were other types of social provisioning like free healthcare, free education system, very kind of well-subsidized transportation system, but also workplace canteens where people could eat for free, or again, for very low money, they could have breakfasts or dinners. And very often these services were organized at a workplace, so showing in a sense how closely intertwined productive and social reproductive processes were. So this was quite a unique feature of state socialist countries. It really distinguished them from other welfare states, which also in Western Europe or North America, which also took on some social provisioning, but to a much lesser extent. In Western Europe, there was more of an expectation that those will be carried out within the family or in the private sector. Now, in Poland also, even though the state was very actively involved in organizing social reproduction and providing those services, there was still some expectation that residual work of social reproduction will be carried out within homes. And this was, in a sense, also linked to the fact that state socialist countries had economies of shortage, particularly in the 70s and 80s. Often there was shortage of goods and supplies, and so also people didn't have access to appliances and many domestic tasks, which normally can be done very quickly because there are machines to help us do them, had to be carried out manually. So Poland and other Central Eastern European countries were also kind of early examples of economies where women were expected and did fully participate in employment, in paid employment, but also had a double burden of other kind of domestic work that they had to carry out, despite the fact that there was some extensive or more extensive social provision available at the same time. Since 1989, as Poland transitioned from this state socialist plan economy to a free market democratic model, the state progressively withdrew from its role in provisioning and supporting social reproduction. It also withdrew from its role as the guarantor of employment and the biggest in a sense, the biggest employer in the country. As state companies and enterprises became privatized and sold off, many of them went bankrupt, the unemployment rates really increased, and unemployment became particularly high among women. It's now come down to very low levels. I think currently unemployment in Poland is 5%, but in 2000 the unemployment rate was as high as 20%. So this the kind of existence of unemployment was one key feature of a post-transitioning Poland, and it was a problem particularly for women. And the second issue was that the state withdrew its responsibility for provisioning, as I already said. This meant that many of the publicly provided services were either no longer provided or were privatized and again lessened or became more expensive. And there was a kind of a assumption that most of this kind of social provisioning work and care work will be either carried out within households or organized by private households and families and outsourced to the market. So this had specific consequences then. It created an even heavier burden, double burden for women, and this feeling or experience of a conflict between work and family became even more exacerbated. Two consequences of that were to either push some women out of labor markets entirely, since they were already struggling with unemployment, and then this kind of conflict between work and family, while other women continued to experience the conflict, and many chose to delay decisions about having families and children. So many young women had fewer children, and in post-transitioning Poland, what we have are kind of two sets of consequences. One is high unemployment, the other one is a very low fertility rate. And many Polish governments since transition have been really, many of the social policies that we have in Poland since transition really have been aimed at tackling those dual problems of unemployment and low fertility. Okay, so the recognition that these two sets of problems, low employment rates and low fertility, were somehow related to each other, didn't really come on the policy radar until about mid-2000s. By this time, demographers in Poland started to ring alarm bells about aging population and the fact that low fertility rates meant low replacement rate of the population, and they pointed out that this would have significant consequences for sustainability of pension systems in the future. On the other hand, they also pointed out that, this is demographers and sociologists, pointed out that there was evidence that there was a relationship between employment and likelihood that women would have a second child, or families would decide to have a second child. And so specifically, the evidence showed that women would be willing to, many Polish women were willing to have a second child only if they were also in employment. So those two sets of kind of demographic research suggested that supporting work-family reconciliation for women workers was really essential to also supporting, not only boosting overall employment, but also supporting the likelihood they would have more children and all the kind of social consequences of that. At the same time, Poland was by now in the EU, so the policy of kind of work-family reconciliation and gender equality had been mainstream at this point in European policy discourse, but also throughout various policy areas, social policy areas that the EU promoted and had some kind of influence over. So it's in light of this context then that I'm going to now move to the two sets of reforms as examples of how the Polish governments had tackled this issue of work-family reconciliation. So the first reforms that I wanted to talk about were enacted after 2009 by a center-right government of the Civic Platform. The first kind of measure that I want to discuss was actually introduced in the context of an anti-crisis bill. So at this point, there's an economic crisis in Europe, and even though Poland's not experiencing this crisis very severely, nonetheless, the Civic Platform introduced this anti-crisis bill to kind of prevent and anticipate any negative consequences that the economic crisis would have on the Polish economy. And in the context of this bill, they introduced a couple of provisions related to working time flexibility. So you know from reading Judy Fudge's article that working time flexibility is one of the ways in which work-family reconciliation policies have been, or kind of strategies for work and family reconciliation have been promoted and achieved. And so the Polish working time regime was considered to be quite rigid, and over the period of transition, various governments tried to flexibilize it. And in this anti-crisis bill, the Civic Platform introduced two provisions to make the working time regime even more flexible. The first one was to introduce a right to request reduced hours of work for parents of children under 13 and for carers of dependent adults. So this was a significant kind of innovation that did not exist in the Polish working time regime before, the Polish labor code before. It added a significant and kind of gender neutrally framed provision for potentially reducing hours of work in a context where people were generally working long hours, because part-time work is not really popular in Poland, and historically hours of work have been quite long in the country. So that was quite significant and judged to be positive from a perspective of work and family reconciliation. But on the other hand, the Civic Platform also introduced another flexibility provision, which enabled employers to significantly increase hours of work over periods of time. So this provision specifically allowed calculation of overtime hours to be made over 12-month periods, which meant that employers could schedule potentially very long hours of work over certain periods of time, and then shorter hours of work, or even days off for other periods of time, as long as the hours over a period of a year averaged out to 40 hours a week. So as you can imagine, this kind of a measure and this kind of way of organizing time isn't necessarily particularly family friendly, because if people have to work very, very long hours of work over periods of time and they have a family at the same time, it may be difficult to strike the appropriate balance. And so in some ways you can see that the two sets of measures in a sense tend to cancel each other out, because on the one hand you have something positive, a right to reduce hours of work, on the other hand you have a right to increase hours of work that employers have. So there's a danger then with this kind of policy setup that somebody will have to submit to those long hours of work, and if you already have kind of an uneven division of labor within the home, and women tend to assume more responsibility for care, then it's more likely that they will not be able to subject themselves or submit to those kinds of temporal constraints, and they will either be excluded from the kinds of sectors where those long hours of work are permitted, or simply will have a very difficult time reconciling work and family. And on the other hand, it's possible then that men will be more likely to assume those or find work in those kinds of sectors, or be able to maintain their employment in those kinds of sectors, with consequences for their own ability to partake in provision of care within a home. So kind of a mixed set of measures, that one. The Civic Platform then subsequently introduced other kinds of measures aimed at helping parents balance work and family reconciliation. So the second set of measures I wanted to talk about is an extension to the maternity leave. So leaves for care related to children are another kind of important way in which work and family reconciliation policies often function. And at the time, the maternity leave in Poland was set at 26 weeks at full 100% income replacement. And the Civic Platform decided to extend this leave by another 26 weeks with a lower 60% replacement rate for that additional period. Now, there was some critique over whether or not this was an appropriate way to help women reconcile work and family, because specifically it is aimed only at women, and it is known that returning to labor markets after long periods of absence is more challenging, particularly in a context such as Poland at the time, where unemployment was a problem and women were struggling with it even more. So there's the critique of that measure was that it heightened, in a sense, the possibility that women would be discriminated against or not hired if they were in the age group where pregnancy was a possibility, or that they would face barriers to coming back to work after. And finally, another set of measures that the Civic Platform introduced during this period was around childcare provision. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was a kind of a reduction in or state withdrawal from responsibility for provision of care, and a lot of care facilities closed down, and so people didn't really. There was a lot of children in Poland were not able to be placed in a kindergarten or a creche or other type of early childhood education institution. So Civic Platform committed to make more extensive provision of care and to kind of invest in more extensive provision of care. And they promised by 2017, and this was in 2011, they promised that they would place every child in Poland that needed to be in a care facility But the way that they chose to do this was by the private route. So rather than fund publicly publicly available and organized childcare facilities, they instead went about a program of privatizing public care facilities by outsourcing the delivery of care to smaller or larger but privately organized facilities. And so another critique then of that was that, of course, private care isn't always available because the rates at which, or the costs of private care tend to be more expensive, and private care institutions maybe are set up more extensively in larger cities, but many small towns, for instance, didn't have them. So there was some critique over this over how likely this kind of public care strategy was going to actually assist most working parents, especially those in smaller towns and those with lower incomes. So that was one kind of set of policies that was introduced by the Civic Platform in between 2009 and 2015. In 2015, there was then a change in government, and Civic Platform was ousted by a traditionalist, kind of populist right-wing party called Law and Justice, which is still governing at the moment. And Law and Justice had a very different approach to supporting working families and working women in particular. One of the very early measures that Civic Platform, that Law and Justice introduced was to provide each family with a child with 500 złotych, so that's about $150, supplement for each child that the family had. And this was again intended to provide income for families who had children, to also encourage families to have more children potentially, and to enable them to organize the care or have funding for care as they deemed fit. And so this set of policies then was did in fact provide families with significant financial support, but the critique of that kind of approach was that it incentivized, in a sense, women to remain at home with children for much longer, and for the provision of care to be organized really very much at a household level as opposed to even at a market level. So two different sets of approaches, the civic platforms and the law and justices, they both, as you can see, in a sense, prioritize private delivery of social reproduction, specifically care services, but the civic platform approach was very much one of private provision through the market, with some choice for parents to remain at home, particularly women, and the maternity leave extension was an example of that. And then the law and justice approach, which very much also emphasized private provision of care, but with an incentive for women to stay at home much more permanently, and in a sense return to a kind of more breadwinner housewife model that Poland had really only before over a period of time before the Second World War. So those are the two examples I wanted to draw your attention to, and I hope that you can see how thinking about social reproduction, its recognition and redistribution, is kind of helpful in evaluating whether or not the kinds of reforms that governments adopt are actually likely to redistribute those essential social reproductive tasks, particularly care, between different institutions, or whether they make very specific choices about which institutions should really assume those responsibilities. And those choices are always political and ideological. They aren't necessarily neutral. And perhaps in your discussions later today, in your seminar, you can again look at those measures and think about whether or not they are actually which set of these measures is perhaps more effective, or what kinds of problems beyond the ones that I identified are also associated with that kind of that way of organizing social policy, and particularly measures aimed at supporting care. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.